if the lens is to really be applied in the way that you're kind of coming at it, and this is where we're going to push and pull a little bit on this. I think that that's the place where we need to kind of dive in and say, okay, let's talk about what this means if he really was Jesus the Nazarene, what that movement was, and then how that would influence his way of understanding killing and like all kinds of killing. Because let's start with this premise. I think we can both agree, right, that Jesus was a pacifist, probably more than anything else. Like if you look at the majority of his, not just turn the other cheek, but love your enemy, right? Don't even become angry. Leave your anger. If we're talking about Matthew 5, Sermon on the Mount, it starts off in that chapter 5 is one of the most pacifistic type of teachings that you will find anywhere. And to me, a lot of Christianity hinges on Matthew chapter 5. So I would agree with you that he's a pacifist. He's definitely against violence. I think I can say that. We can both kind of agree on that. But then we have to take it to another level, I think, with the Nazarene thing. So let's talk about that. To explain in your own words, kind of this concept of what is the Nazarene movement? Where did it come from? Like, let's walk through that concept because that's really critical to all of this.
The Nazarene movement is essentially this movement that's mentioned by the patristics. There's documentation from historical record, even secular. Pliny the Elder mentions the Tetrarchy of the Nazarini. He mentions them in the first century, because I think Pliny the Elder died somewhere around like 73 AD or something like that, maybe even earlier. But he was using material from a census that I think went all the way back to 30 BC. So we know there was this area where these Nazarenes occupied. It's believed to be the Transjordan area, Pella, the Decapolis, etc. And the idea is that this kind of broader term that's a little bit of a misnomer in and of itself, but many scholars use it because it's the best kind of idea, is this understanding of the Essenes, right? That in the time of Jesus, there were 3 sects of Judaism: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Pharisees and the Sadducees we hear about like crazy in the scripture because Jesus is, cracking, theological skulls with them, let's say, back and forth with these different concepts. But we don't ever hear about the Essenes. And there's probably 2 reasons for that. One is because they're really out on the outskirts. They're in the Transjordan, they're off. But maybe there's at least some idea that like Jesus, the same that John the Baptist is somewhat tied to those groups potentially. Most scholars have some idea that he would be based off of his lifestyle and what he's doing. That Jesus maybe is kind of arising from these types of groups, that these, even though he comes from a Judaic lineage and et cetera, that maybe there was this idea that they practiced a little bit more of this, I don't want to call it ascetic, but just critical of the temple system and the corruption that was going on there on various levels. So within the writings that we have about these Essene groups, there are writings of the Nazarenes, and there's all kinds of spellings that get involved with how you spell Nazarene. But looking to the Gospels, we have Jesus referred to as Jesus the Nazarene multiple times, far more times than we have him referred to as Jesus of Nazareth, like by a landslide. And I believe, Luke and John, if I'm not mistaken, refer to him as Jesus the Nazarene exclusively. And Luke uses 2 different spellings for that term. One of them, Nazoraios, it's really complicated to try to tie that to a town named Nazareth, just linguistically with the spelling. And the other, Nazarenos, is similar, but not, it's a lot easier to tie that to Nazareth. And then in the Gospel of John, Nazoraios, that sectarian spelling, is the same spelling that it's, outlined as on the cross with the sign that Pilate creates, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews, right? Nazoraios. And that, again, is the same spelling that later in Acts, the Apostle Paul is accused of being a ringleader of the sect of Nazarenes. And so we get that sectarian label. Now, the argument there would be that, okay, well, Jesus has already been crucified and risen at this point, and now there's this sect of Nazarenes that are following him, and they call themselves that because he's Jesus of Nazareth. But the problem there is, again, Pliny the Elder's documentation of the Tetrarchy of the Nazarini, going back potentially as early as 30 BC, and multiple indications, even from Isaiah 9, it says that the messianic figure is going to be coming from Galilee of the Gentiles. And when you look at the historical data, Galilee of the Gentiles isn't just the area that we know as, the northern part of Israel now. It does extend Transjordan into some of these areas. We know that Jesus did a lot of his ministry in the Transjordan. And so, bottom line, the Tetrarchy of the Nazarini that Pliny the Elder describes is Transjordan and going towards Syria. So the idea is that maybe it wasn't Nazareth, the town that we know today, but it's this area of the Nazareans, which was a whole sect of kind of Essene-like, if you will, Jews who had rejected the temple system long before, all the way back to the tribes of Reuben and Gad who settled over there, as the Old Testament says. And they're really trying to preserve this way of Judaism that's like the way in the wilderness, which in its own way was a return to the ideal. They're living off the manna in the Old Testament and the Exodus. Epiphanius particularly is the real dead ringer in that he describes two different sects of the Nazarenes spelled exactly the same other than one consonant, which is a natural shift linguistically from Aramaic to Greek and Latin. So most likely scholars, like Dr. Tabor and a number of other scholars would say, there's a high possibility here that Epiphanius is just obfuscating the language because he's either A, confused, or B, he's a little bit of a hostile witness because he's got them listed in his book of heretics, right? And in the description of the Nazarenes, it says that they specifically rejected animal sacrifice and even consumption of flesh because they believed that it was unlawful to do so, and that this all went back to kind of really original Mosaic law where Moses is trying to restore this Edenic ideal, but the tribes aren't having it. And so then they have to come back and priests get involved and they create these 600 liturgical laws and all the animal sacrificial ritual and all this stuff. So bottom line, that's it's like you said, what we said at the beginning, it's quite the web to unravel and it's so much context and understanding, but that would be the argument for who the Nazarenes were. Then if we want to talk about how can we tie Jesus to this, ultimately, like I said, the Gospels point to a sectarian designation for Jesus as Jesus the Nazarene. But when you look at John the Baptist, his lifestyle as the forerunner of Jesus, James the Just, Jesus' brother after him, James the Just is described explicitly as objecting the consumption of animals, wearing only linen and not wool, and mixing that the way that some of the
and is that coming from Josephus? Who are we talking about for James?
James is coming from Eusebius, the father of church history, and he is quoting Hegesippus, and Hegesippus was one of the most profound early Jewish Christian historians, if you will. And he's quoting him, and he's not objecting. And when you talk to, say, any of the top scholars in the field of early Christianity, they all agree that this is most likely an accurate description of James the Just. Probably why he gets his name, James the Just or the Righteous. But he's the leader of the movement after Jesus in Jerusalem. They end up having to flee to Pella because of the destruction of the temple and all of that. James has already, been martyred before this, but they end up back in the Transjordan. And so that's the path of the Nazarenes after Jesus, is they end up having to flee with the war and all of that. And they wind up in the Decapolis and the Transjordan and kill Syria. And there's all kinds of attestation from the church fathers about them. The real dead ringer is Jesus's act in the temple. That's why I started with that early in the conversation. Is it's one of the few events documented in every single gospel and in a certain detail. And it's one of the very few events that historians across the board, even secular, agree most likely happened. Even the ones that are skeptical in the historicity of Jesus, is that they believe something like this event happened. It reminds me of Star Wars. when Luke Skywalker is the guy out on Tatooine in no man's land, which is the kind of Nazareth or Nazara or Tetrarchy of the Nazarean, if you will. And eventually, at some point, he takes the X-Wing fighter straight into the Death Star. And it's like he's going right into the heart of the matter. When other people are maybe trying to just stay on the outskirts and be ascetics or whatever, that's their protest. He's like, no, we got to change this from the inside. We got to bring the truth to the masses and to the place where truth is supposed to emanate from, right? And so he goes to the temple and he performs this act. And when you see that in the Gospels, even the Gospels where again, historians have differing opinions on how much of it's historical or not. What we do see is that in every gospel account, it mentions that he is attacking or the physicality of the revolt is at the cattle dealers, the merchants, those buying and selling. And even in John, it specified the doves and the oxen and the sheep are let free. And then the money changers part, which we're all taught on Sunday school or on Easter when he's flipping the tables, that's mentioned after the fact. And in Luke, it's not even mentioned at all, the money changers part. So I do think that there's an element of corruption with the financial aspect of what's going on, but I think we've missed that there's this deep implication about all the killing, all the bloodshed. And that really goes back to, I think, Jesus's understanding of the prophets. You know, Jeremiah is the one who he's quoting that says, this is meant to be a house of prayer. Well, Isaiah says the house of prayer part, but Jeremiah says, you've made it a den of paritz, which is the Hebrew, and that word has deeper implications than thieves. It's violent ones, murderers, shedders of blood. In Ezekiel 18:10, paritz is defined as a shedder of blood. It says, yeah.
Well, I was gonna let's dive into this for a second because I think this is an interesting question here, because when we're talking about the temple as an example, because you mentioned the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, but you left out the Zealots, which is I think in my opinion, and this is of course this is where I come down more solidly. I think that there's more of a case to be made that he's part of the Zealot faction than he would be even of the Essenes or the Pharisees. And the reason I say that is because when we dive into, I agree with you. I think that the historicity behind him going into the temple seems very high to me. I think the issue that we run into, because this was something that was always fascinating to me, what does it actually say? And we have to go based off of, we know historically, Mark is written first, probably around 70. Matthew, we think that that's written sometime around 80. Luke is, it's questionable. Most people put it at 85, somewhere in there, but you could go as late as 115 because of some of the references. So it could be actually later than John. John, you have 90 for the first iteration, but really it's rewritten. And you have 3 different iterations of it that are actually created. So you're looking at somewhere probably by 100, you have close to what we're used to in our New Testament. So this led me back to ask the question, okay, so what happens, you go into the temple, like what actually is literally, let's put Jesus aside, like what happens during those high holy days during Passover? And one of the things that I discovered is that because, as you brought up, there is so many financial implications behind what's going on there. I mean, this is hugely profitable, not just for the temple, but for everybody in town. Just, it's like, the Super Bowl comes to town, everybody gets money, right? Or whatever, right? There's just a lot of business that transacts at that point in time. So what you can find is that actually in the temple, they actually increase security a lot. So because normally they have soldiers wandering around anyway, but now you have so many people coming in and out, buying the sacrifices, doing all that stuff at the security side. Now, what does it say? Let's use Mark as the kind of starting point. Because to me, and this is my opinion, I don't know how true this is, but this is where I come to. I think Mark is the closest we get to the actual historical Jesus. Everything after that, you're starting to add layers of things that either did it in, we get into Q, the Q source, we get into all these different types of sources of where they come from. And by the time we get to John, That's where I feel like it's the least historically accurate in many ways. So I'm going to stick with Mark because that tends, for me, it's 70. It's closest to, if we say just for round numbers, Jesus dies at 30, that gives us a 40-year gap. That's kind of the closest we get to like a narrative version of Jesus. So he goes into the temple, like we said, and let's just say either way, whether he's tossing money, whether he's letting things go, right? I think the issue that we run into is this, what it says in the gospel is he literally walks out. Like literally, according to what it says, he does his stuff and he's like, all right, I'll see you guys later. And he walks out. Now, do you know of any situation where there's huge amount of security anywhere at any part of, whatever happens, somebody does something and the security just says, particularly Roman soldiers, by the way, are going to be like, hey man, I just letting off some steam, I guess, right? You go back into the city and you go teach and preach and do whatever you're going to do. No. Like at that time, particularly when Pilate is in control, and Pilate had zero tolerance policy, if we're basing it off of what we see from Josephus, this is a guy who got literally, they were writing complaints from the aristocracy to the legate of Syria saying, this guy is putting people to death literally without trial. Like he's just signing the death warrants. He's not even putting them on trial. So Pilate, right, is he going to just say, that's okay? No, he would be arrested sight on scene. I don't think he would have even left the temple. My guess is, if it's me guessing historically, he gets arrested then and there, and bam, it's just straight, if he even has a trial, but it's basically straight to the cross. Now, the reason I bring this up is because when you leave out the zealot part of it, by the way, we need to say with all of this, it's all speculation. We don't know for sure. Your guess is as good as mine. I'm just giving you what I think historically makes the most sense. To me, I think he went into the temple, just as you said, and I think that from a zealot perspective, he's essentially going in because of the corruption of the temple, because it's tied. Every priest had to be 100% vetted by Rome. Like not a single priest in there wasn't given the thumbs up by Pilate and Rome because they were going to be loyal to them. So the very idea of you going in and you sacrificing, which according to Jewish law is a very critical aspect of how you are Jewish. I mean, that's a critical aspect to that. I think that the protest is against that. And because he's a zealot and because he's apocalyptic, like that's a whole other aspect to this, which is you're talking about the kingdom of heaven. He's bringing the kingdom of God to earth, right? I feel you walk in there, any reasonable person knows you walk in there, you do what he does, you're going to get arrested and you're going to get put on the cross. And I think he intentionally does that. He tells us that he knows that's where he's headed. And there's no better way to do that than doing what he did going into there. So for me, and this is just me, I think that the political implications, the fact that it's corrupt, to me, in my understanding of the Jesus that I look at historically, that trumps in many ways maybe the consideration that you're bringing in only because, and I'm welcome for you to come back on this, only because to me, what I see him through the lens of a Jewish man who cares deeply about his people, and that the temple represents a corruption of the faith. And that by going in we can get into a whole conversation about what happens with Christianity the people of the way early on, because we're talking about the Nazarene, another term that's used for them in Acts, because that term Nazarene is in Acts, but the term that's more often used in Acts is people of the way, literally, that's used over and over and over again. So his way of being as a Jewish man. So to me, those are the things that kind of trump the consideration of why was he there to do it. To me, I look at it and say, he's a zealot, he's apocalyptic, he wants to bring the kingdom of God. He feels that if he gets up on the cross, that's going to happen. And so that's the role that he goes down, and that's the role that he plays. So I think that in hearing what you're talking about, and I'm gonna say one thing about Eusebius, which I think is which is hard for me, because we're talking about several centuries later, and a lot of his stuff. So in the circles that I run in, Eusebius, the bias that he has is kind of like it's super biased towards in the same way that Josephus, when you read his stuff, you see this huge bias towards towards the people who are funding his writing this. So I guess that so to me, for Eusebius, it's hard to trust everything that he's saying. I'm not saying that you're not, like, I love your scholarship around the Nazareans and connecting them with the Essenes. And I even go so far as to say, I agree with you that John the Baptist was probably connected with them as well. And I would even go so far as to say that because Jesus was connected with John, I would say that probably is true, that those people adopted, I would totally agree with you that they probably adopted a lesser killing policy. However, if we're talking about why he goes into the temple, I'm gonna go towards, I'm gonna say that that may be a consideration, but I think the bigger consideration is that Rome, that the Messiah, literally the king, the whole point of the Messiah is to make an independent Israel apart from an empire or any other entity that's controlling them, which right now they are. And that, of course, the will of God has to come through. That's their kind of concept, right? The will of God comes through through that political power. That's what David was to them. He's that mirror of the king. He literally would dispense God's will. Christianity gets away from that idea completely because we have the Holy Spirit. You can be anywhere. You don't have to have a political entity to dispense God's will. Islam picks that up again. So they pick up the Jewish idea. They move forward with it. So I guess that's some of the things that I'm hearing, which is to say, I'm convinced by certain aspects of your argument because I actually think that there's a lot of validity to it. I just don't know if we know the truth, like because you're getting into his motivation, like why did he do the thing? And I think that's really hard to say. We're both guessing at it. So I've given you my perspective on why I think my guess is best. Give me your perspective on why you think your guess is best for why you think his motivation was around the killing of animals.
Oh yeah, great. That was a great line of thinking too, and fully follow what you're saying. And in fact, some of what you said just sparked some ideas in my head of some avenues I want to go down, particularly around the nature of the temple event and the immediate arrest, because that's something I've always felt too. I've always felt there's no way he got away with that. And some of my thinking has been in the past, and you've got me wanting to like maybe look into this road a little more, was the idea of if there is a quote unquote Last Supper of some sort, is it actually before the temple?
That's exactly what I believe.
Everyone, he's preparing everyone and saying, hey, it's going down tomorrow. This is it. I won't be eating this again with you guys until we're eating in the kingdom. You know what I mean? So, anyways, but that being said, there's a lot that I want to cover there, and I was trying to parse out while you were saying it, like where I would even start. So, I agree with you, Mark. To the best of our knowledge now, until scholarship develops even further, it's always changing, right? But we're pretty confident that Mark is the earliest gospel. I agree. I always go to Mark first in the Greek Gospels. But one thing that's really shaped a lot for me was understanding the attestation from all the early church fathers around an earlier Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. I don't know if you've heard about this or looked into it much. And if you haven't, I highly recommend, don't take my word for it. Anyone listening to, by the way, with all of this, don't take my word for it. Just go look at all, like challenge what I'm saying. Go look at it yourself, because I do agree with the Augustine quote. It's one of my favorites, that the truth is like a lion. Just let it loose and it'll defend itself. Like, I don't need, if you go to Eusebius, Jerome, Epiphanius, even the earliest Papias, who I think is quoted, he's quoted by Irenaeus maybe, but all of the church fathers attest to this idea that there is a Gospel of Matthew, literally dictated by Matthew, written by Matthew in Aramaic using Hebrew letters. Jerome mentions this gospel when he's, leading up to his time of composing the Vulgate, most likely, that he gets a copy of this gospel from the Nazarenes and Ebionim in Borea. And he mentions, Epiphanius mentions, these church fathers all allude to this idea that these Nazarene, Ebionim, early Jewish Christian, Hebrew Christian Judaizers, sometimes they call them, that they use this gospel. This is the gospel that they use. The general consensus is that there is this gospel that was written by Matthew. And in that gospel, it's documented by Epiphanius that Jesus specifically rejects the Passover lamb. And in a mirror to the claim in Luke 22, where he says, I have desired to eat this. I have verily, the wording is kind of funny in the Greek, but I have a great desire to eat this Passover with you, but I will not eat it again until the kingdom, sort of thing, what we were just talking about. In the Gospel of Matthew, in Hebrew letters, it's, I have no desire to eat the flesh of this lamb with you, is literally the way that it reads. And it's documented by Epiphanius, and he's so mad about it that it says this. It also says that he declared, I have come to abolish the sacrifices. Unless you cease from sacrificing, wrath will not cease from you. So, two very clear indications of a direct opposition to animal sacrifice and the Passover lamb ritual, which paired with what we do have in the Greek Gospels, and let's just stick with Mark, this tradition of the Last Supper, where all that is mentioned is the bread, the unleavened bread, and the wine, which we know is most likely like a really low alcohol content grape juice type of thing. But the later Nazareans and Ebionites, they even celebrated their Eucharist with unleavened bread and water. Fair enough, like we get into certain realms of speculation here, but these Nazarenes are documented by the church fathers and the Ebionim, two different names for the same group. They're documented as not fully accepting the Torah. They believed that Moses had received a law, but that it had been corrupted. And we have attestation from Jeremiah in our own, Pentateuch now, our own Tanakh now, that says, the Bible, it says in Jeremiah 8, verse 8, the lying pen of the scribes, as in the pen that you write with, the lying pen of the scribes has falsified the Torah. And Jeremiah is the prophet that Jesus keeps quoting over and over again. People don't realize how much Jesus quotes Jeremiah. When he says, come, I'll make you fishers of men, that's Jeremiah 16:16, most likely. And that's another instance where he's, again, it's for this argument in a way, he meets fishermen, disciples, and he calls them away from their profession. They leave their nets behind, that's kind of interesting. But constantly he's quoting Jeremiah to the point where he even gets confused to Jeremiah. Remember, I forget what the verse is off the top of my head, but they say, who is this guy? Is he Elijah? Is he this? Is he Jeremiah? Because Jeremiah had such a staunch rebuke of the temple and in his day. And Jeremiah even talks about this corruption to the scripture, how God's law is written on our heart. And there's so many more implications that we can get into with modern scholarship